Well, hello, Velvet Ashes. Welcome to this month's Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast. Do we have a treat for you? Have you missed out on Velvet Ashes resident scholar, Dr. Laura Chevalier Beer? Well, she is back. It's been a few months, but if you are someone that loves digging into the history and the knowledge and the education behind some of these women in history and the impact that they made on the missions world, you're in for a treat today. Today, she is joined by our very own Sarah Hilkeman as they discuss Mary Lane Clarke. Mary Lane Clarke is someone who is a contemporary for some of us, potentially. She lived to be nearly 100 years old. Today, you get to hear about her work in Sierra Leone, the impact that her translation work had on the world in general, and so many stories as she just continued with her missional heart through the end of her life. So looking forward to what is in store for you today. What a treat. And as always, we want to thank Barnabas International for making this podcast possible. We're so happy to be able to sit here with you every month, bringing you these legacy stories. And a big thanks to Barnabas for making that happen. All right, here is your Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the Velvet Ashes Legacy Podcast. I'm Sarah Hilkeman, and this month I'm joined by Dr. Laura Chevalier Beer, our Velvet Ashes resident scholar. Laura, it's been a bit since you've been on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be back. We've taken a little bit of a break here the last couple of months, but we have some exciting stories to share in the coming months.
Yes, I am so grateful for you and the ways that you bring us these stories and also connect us to other people that can bring us these stories so that we really have the opportunity to think not only about, the lives and the choices and the sacrifices of these women who have gone before us, but also it kind of gives us an opportunity to reflect on our own lives. And before I forget, Laura and I were talking about this as we were getting ready to hop on. If you have a connection to someone, a legacy woman that you want to be part of sharing their story with us, would you let us know? You can comment on social media as we share about the podcast, or we have Laura's email address in our show notes, but we would love to get connected to you and to be able to share these legacy stories. So yeah, I am excited about the woman that we're going to be talking about today. I think you are going to be inspired by her courage and her faith. So yeah, Laura, let's jump into our legacy story for this month.
Yeah, so this month I am going to talk to you about Mary Lane Clarke. And she's probably not someone that most of you have heard of unless you come from the denominational background that she was from, but she has a pretty incredible story. So Mary Lane Clarke lived from December 1st, 1872 to May 4th, 1970. She was 97 years old when she passed away.
Which is so amazing. Just thinking too is almost 100 years old. And this kind of dates me, Laura, but 1970, I wasn't born yet, but it doesn't feel like that long ago.
It's really not that long ago. And her legacy was very much alive when I first encountered her story. So I first heard about her story when I attended Houghton College in upstate New York. It's a small Wesleyan Christian college, and I was in the intercultural studies program there, and I heard about her life through some of the professors that probably had known her, actually. Wow. So yeah, like you said, it's not really that far removed from our life today.
Wow, cool.
So on November 29th, 1965, about 5 years before she passed, Mary Lane Clarke recorded the following words after sharing some biographical details of her life. Quote, she said, "It is with deep humility and much hesitancy that I give these facts and wonder at the marvels of God's grace in saving and keeping me these 93 years, through sickness and through health, through falls, several without a broken bone, for complete recovery from major cancer operation over 23 years ago with never a sign of return. The splendid advance now being made in every department of our Sierra Leone mission work is a cause for gratitude beyond expression, and we can only say, what hath God wrought? To him be the glory." So that just gives you a little taste of the humility and the reverence that she approached her work with, and just giving all of the glory to God, and so focused on the mission of God in the work that her denomination had done in Sierra Leone in particular. So Mary had sailed for Sierra Leone in 1900 to marry pioneer Wesleyan Methodist missionary George Clarke. George's first wife, Anna Perrin Clarke, had actually died in 1897 after suffering from blackwater fever. This is hematuria, a severe complication of malaria. And she had that several times just before they were to return to the United States, and then she passed. And so George came back to the U.S. as a widower. So just to give you a little background on the Wesleyan Methodist Connection, or church, as it was sometimes called, it was formed in 1843 in Utica, New York, in protest to the Methodist Episcopal Church's pro-slavery stance. So the Methodist Episcopal Church is the Methodist church that we often think of when we think of John Wesley and what he started in North America. And part of the identity of this new Wesleyan Methodist group was its abolitionist outlook. And interestingly, they also championed the rights of women and supported women in ministry, which were some contentious things around that time. In the late 1880s and 90s, the group aligned with the holiness movement, and it's now known as the Wesleyan Church. And as I said before, I had gone to Houghton College, which is now Houghton University, and it was affiliated with the Wesleyan Church.
So Laura, you kind of said this, but they were supportive of the rights of women and supported women in ministry. Was that pretty radical? Like, was that happening in other churches or, denominations and other movements at the time?
Yeah, so the answer is kind of yes and no. It depends on which groups you were part of. So among the holiness groups, this was actually pretty common and part of their ethos, especially later in the 19th century. But the Wesleyan Methodists were particularly focused in this way. In fact, the first women's rights convention was held in 1848 at the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York. And then the Wesleyan Methodists were also instrumental in advocating for women to work and speak in the temperance movement. So if you ever heard of the women's temperance movement, they were a part of that. And a lot of other holiness denominations were as well. They actually first ordained a woman in 1853, Miss Antoinette Brown. And some people suggest that perhaps she was the first to be actually ordained in the modern era. Some other denominations might have given like a license to preach, which was slightly different. But in the history of Christianity, views on ordination have ebbed and flows over the years regarding women. However, among the more established and older denominations during this particular time period, women were expected to stay in their accepted domains, which was, things more related to the domestic area with the house and the children and things like that. And there is a historical trend for denominations that at one time allowed women to preach and teach to kind of rein this in at some point down the road. So it's kind of a complex history that you see there. There's kind of progress and setbacks. And as churches get more institutionalized, that tends not to favor women being in ministry, which is interesting.
Right. Yeah.
So back to the Wesleyan Methodists. At the General Conference of the Wesleyan Methodist Church in 1887, leaders made the decision to open their first foreign mission field in Sierra Leone. And why they chose Sierra Leone, West Africa, it was because John Augustus Abayomi Cole, a Creole man from Sierra Leone, had actually come over and made a specific request of the denomination. So there are lots of Methodist kind of connections in that part of the world. And he took it upon himself to come over and say, hey, we need more people to come and work over here. So in terms of Sierra Leone, there's a lot of history there that I'm not going to go into, but just to give you a little bit of background, it had been a part of Africa that had been a significant source of slaves for the British colonies during the 17th and 18th centuries. And it actually became a British colony and a protectorate, kind of the interior of the country, in 1787. And then that was enlarged over the years. And eventually it became a location that freed slaves from Nova Scotia and England went to. And through this kind of repatriation of Africans to this part of Africa, there was like a Creole language and culture that developed from that. And Methodism was very strong among that Creole population. So back to Mary. In her early life, she was raised in upstate New York, and she was born into a farming family with a strong Christian faith. And she was born in Linden, New York. That's about 60 miles southeast of Buffalo, New York, if you know where that is, kind of close to Niagara Falls. And in 1886, at the age of 13, she was sent to Houghton Seminary, and now that's Houghton University that I attended. At that time, it was a co-educational high school run by the Wesleyan Methodists, and it was about 12 miles from her home, but she would board there. And the school began offering college courses in the late 19th century. So I'm not sure exactly if she was doing college courses at that time. It just depends on exactly the overlap of when that started happening. The history records that she was converted around the age of 13 or 14, and her favorite verse was, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain," Philippians 1:21. While she attended Houghton, she worked nearby in the summers, and in 1892, she graduated valedictorian of her class. And the courses that she had focused on was the Latin scientific course, and she was very gifted linguistically. That was recognized by people around her. After graduating, she taught in area schools from 1892 to 1895. And the interesting thing that I don't have a lot of information about is kind of how she got interested in mission and what her missionary call was. The Archive of Records, written by her at age 93, that quote that I recorded at the beginning, or read at the beginning, she lists her age of missionary call as from birth. So it sounds like it was something that was just always with her. So even though she didn't really make a commitment to Christ herself until about 13 or 14, she always kind of knew that she was called to be a missionary.
Which is so interesting. I just wonder, what was going on in her family, or what would make her say that call that she really felt like was from birth. That's interesting.
Yeah, it was just a part of her life from as early as she could remember, I guess, is kind of what she was getting at.
Yeah. Well, she was obviously, a very smart, a very gifted student. It's always fun to kind of get a glimpse into what these women were like as kids, and like how that plays out as they got older and went to the field. And yeah, I think we'll see that. But so you said this was a seminary. Do you know if it was any of the classes she was taking were like what we would think of as seminary, like theology classes or those types of things, or was it really more the Latin?
I think at that time, it probably wasn't what we would consider seminary work today. Like I said, the college courses came very late in the 19th century, so she was probably ending around the time that they were starting. But she definitely was getting some sort of Bible training and theology training there. Yeah. But I don't know that it was at the, seminary now is kind of graduate level work. I don't think that's the kind of training that she was getting. And I would say the holiness movement wasn't as interested in making sure that you had all this like extended theological education, like some of the older denominations would have been at that time. That has increased as the years go on, as there's more institution building that happens. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, as we said, she was quite gifted linguistically and clearly a good student. And a few years after graduating from Houghton Seminary, she actually began teaching German and Latin there. So she was good enough that they wanted her to come back and teach. And she did that for about 5 years. In 1896, while she was teaching, she met Reverend George Clarke, who was a young English missionary, and he had just lost his wife, and he was doing advanced studies at Houghton. While he was there, he met Mary.
Do you know, were they close in age? She was teaching and...
Yeah, so he was actually 5 years older than her.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if she was actually teaching him or not, but
sure.
They crossed paths because they were both there.
Okay.
So in 1898, there was an uprising that happened in Sierra Leone where local Christians and some of the missionaries from other groups were massacred, actually. Mm-hmm. And the Wesleyan Methodists had a close relationship with that mission, the United Brethren. And because of just the turmoil that was going on, George was recalled to Sierra Leone. The Wesleyan Methodists called him back there. And so he stopped his studies and he returned to Sierra Leone. So that was like probably about a 2-year period that he was at Houghton. It's not clear if they maintained a correspondence, but it's pretty likely that they did, because in June 1900, Mary sailed to Africa to be married to George. So she got
something
there.
happened.
Yeah, something happened. And she got there and they were married almost immediately. And then they began to minister and work together. And one of the notable aspects of the relationship that I just love seeing as I was reading is just the mutuality that you see. They seem to value and respect each other for their gifts and ideas, and they work together at like a true team. They even later wrote a history of the Sierra Leone mission together. And you can see in their writings that they're always commending one or the other. She always gives him credit for things, and he always gives her credit for things. And when you hear other people speaking about them, it's always like they were together.
That's cool.
Yeah. So her first term of service started in 1900, and she mostly worked with the Temne tribes in Kunso. And she learned the Temne language from books and taught in the school there that had already been established. And George served as the superintendent of the mission and did that for most of the time that he was on the field. And one thing that I didn't mention before that I think is really important for the context, we already heard that George's first wife died from complications from malaria, but diseases like malaria and others were super common in the region. And there was just a tremendous amount of death that the Wesleyan Methodists experienced. At least 10 people died of this blackwater fever, the complications of malaria, between 1890 and 1910. So Mary is coming into this context where there's already been a significant amount of people that have died for the cause of Christ. And actually the first person who died was a 6-year-old child, missionary child. And so, yeah, just some heaviness there for sure. And Mary did not escape this actually herself. In 1906, she contracted blackwater fever and had to return to Houghton in upstate New York. And she ended up seeing a specialist in Buffalo, New York. And he pretty much said, like, there's no hope. She's probably going to pass away. It's probably imminent, and prepare yourselves. But the women of the church prayed for her recovery. And that very night that after she had seen the specialist, she experienced a vision from God. And she describes it this way. She said, "There were angels ascending and descending, 3 people I didn't know. That night I got a call to go back to Africa's Limba country, and the next morning God touched me." And Mary experienced a miraculous recovery, like kind of unheard of. Like she was on death's door, and all of a sudden she was able-bodied and fully recovered.
Wow, that is incredible. As you were sharing that, Laura, I was just thinking, one of the things we talk about with cross-cultural workers is that we kind of get this front row seat to see the incredible things that God does. And we see this, with this amazing recovery for Mary. But then, you were just talking about this incredible amount of death. All of these other missionaries that didn't experience this miraculous recovery. And I don't know, it just makes me think of like all of the questions that we also wrestle with in cross-cultural life. And, I don't know what Mary's response was, if she thought, like, why me? Why did I get to live and these other people didn't? But yeah, I think we have this tension, and I think a lot of us as cross-cultural workers have wrestled with getting to see the amazing things that God does, but then also the really hard. And yeah, when we see the people that we love struggling, the people that we are living among struggling, and all those kinds of things. And so, yeah, just that, the beauty and the hard of cross-cultural life.
For sure. And I think for Mary and others that did live and did survive, there were 2 things that I see in the record that really stood out. One is that it made them feel like we have to make it worth it. Their sacrifice has to make it has to be worth it. We have to make sure that we are faithful and do the work that we've been called to do. And then second, looking back, they almost always say, we should have had a trained medical doctor as part of the team. And I think they did for a short period at the beginning, but it was like almost too little too late. And then later, in the 20th century, they had someone come too, but they look back like we probably wouldn't have had suffered so much if we had just had, modern medicine with us, like
Right.
someone who knew something with us. So that became part of what they believed was really important in their ministry, is having a medical ministry as part of what they were doing in that region.
Yeah. Well, it seems like, and I think we'll see this more as we go on, but just even from the quote that you read from Mary at the beginning, like it seems like her heart was really giving God the glory and really praising him, and so, yeah, I think I can just imagine that was her response, even to this, with the way that God healed her.
Mm-hmm. So from that miraculous recovery, she and George really felt like they were being called and tasked to do a new work. So as I said before, they had started with the Temne people, and there were other people groups and other language groups that they felt like they wanted to do more work with. And one of those groups were the Limba group family of peoples. And they had originally kind of surveyed that area and thought that was one of the places that they would end up. But the main king, Chief Suluku, he had not been open to them coming. So in 1908, there was a new king that was in charge of that group of people, Chief Kalawa. And he came to power, and he was much more open to Western missionaries coming in. He actually asked for the missionaries to go to a location called Mabai, and he had sent his son to the school that they were already running in Kunso. So it was clear that he was open to the work that they were doing. So in the fall of 1908, they opened a mission station there. And Mary organized the school, and she began with 10 pupils under a large mango tree. You can just picture her, just
Yeah.
sitting out there talking to them. And another missionary started a medical work, they said, under another mango tree. And that October, they experienced a revival with 6 of the students accepting Christ. Now, Mary had learned the Temne language from books, but with Limba, she wanted to take a different approach, and she learned it from the people, and she said that so she could hold all the services in the vernacular. So she took a very different approach. She was just trying to getting out there, talking to people, trying to practice what she learned, probably pointing and asking, what is this? What is that? For the first 8 months, she and George and I think one other missionary lived in local houses that had been built by local people for local people. So they were just living as the people were. And then the chief gave them some land. It had been an old Muslim prayer court. And on this land, they constructed what they called an ideal tropical home for the mission house. So beyond her teaching in the school, and probably the most important work that Mary did while she was in Sierra Leone was use that linguistic gift and her ability to learn the language to help with Bible translation. She put together a Limba English dictionary that later the government used and adopted as something that they wanted to have printed, and it was printed in 1929, and it contained about 1,000 words. And through all of that study and the dictionary and just learning the language, she was able to also begin some Bible translation. And so in 1911, the first ever book printed in the Limba language was the Gospel of Luke, and that was printed in 1911. And Mary was the chief person who was responsible for that. She had help, of course, but it was her work that she had done. And then in 1917, the Gospel of John, that was not fully printed in a larger scale until the 1950s. And then she also worked on Mark and Matthew later in life. She translated 33 gospel songs and hymns, and that was also printed. So she was one of the main people to ensure that the Limba language was committed to writing and that the people were going to receive the Bible in their heart language. So just to back up a little bit with this idea of the heart language, sometimes when we think about the history of mission, and particularly when we're in certain settings, there can be a strong critique of mission work and activity and kind of being an arm of the colonial history that happened in parts of the world, and particularly in Africa. But it's important to recognize the role that Bible translation actually played in preserving languages. West African mission scholar Laman Sane, in his work Translating the Message, The Missionary Impact on Culture, promoted the idea of the translation principle. He argued that vernacular Bible translation and all that it involved, committing spoken languages to written form, effectively empowered local peoples to resist colonial rule. Christian missions were preservers rather than destroyers of indigenous cultures. So this is kind of a contrasting view to some of the views that you might see out there regarding the history of missions. But I do think it's important to bring up here because, as I said, the Gospel of Luke in 1911 that Mary translated was the first book ever printed in the Limba language. So that's what we're talking about here. There had never been a written form of the Limba language, and Mary was involved in that process, in that culture, in that language.
Yeah, that's such a good perspective. And I think, as we look back, there are things that now we know maybe we wish could have been different in missions history, but it is helpful to have that perspective and just to be grateful for Mary's work and her gift in, being good with language and the training that she had and all of that. So just putting in a plug there for kudos to the people doing the hard and beautiful work of translation or even just learning a language. Really have the power of being able to communicate in the heart language of people. And I love that sort of perspective of it being a preserver rather than a destroyer of cultures.
Yeah, because if these languages hadn't been written down for the purpose of Bible translation, they may never have been written down.
Yeah, right.
And it's really important to recognize the time that this takes too. Like when you think about other aspects of cross-cultural work, like you can see things happening, but like to be able to translate the whole Bible takes years and years and years and so much effort.
Yeah, right.
So during the same time that Mary was teaching school and working on Bible translation, she and George also welcomed a daughter named Mary Evangeline. She went by Evangeline. And that was in 1913 that she was born. And she was their only child and very close relationship with her parents, I think. And we'll hear a little bit more about her later in Mary's later life. So the Clarkes emphasized educational mission that was focused on children and raising up Indigenous leaders. It wasn't the only means that they used for spreading the gospel, but it was a very important one to them. So altogether, Mary worked for about 12 years total in Sierra Leone. It doesn't really seem like that long for how long she lived, but for another 28 years, she enthusiastically led and taught the children of the Wesleyan Methodist Church through what's called the Young Missionary Workers Band. She was its superintendent based in Houghton, New York, first from 1906 to 08, and then from 1917 to 1943. So that's a total of 28 years.
Wow.
So I just want to share with you a little bit of the story of that organization. Some of my doctoral work, I focused on mission with children. And so this is one of the stories that I uncovered during that research. The story of the YMWB, it's not an easy acronym to say, started in 1900. George began a concerted effort of engaging the children of the Wesleyan Methodist Church in the missionary cause. He wrote letters to the Wesleyan Methodist magazine and enlisted the help of children to raise funds. In October 1900, he called on 8-year-old Coy Hogg, a child he had met while in the U.S., to collect the funds. Coy Hogg enthusiastically responded and began writing letters of his own that were printed in the same magazine. Clarke and Hogg's letters called for children to give their pennies and work to earn more money to donate to the missionary cause. The initiative was successful in engaging children and raising funds.
So, Laura, were these funds going specifically to the Clark's work or George Clark's work, or was it kind of the Wesleyan Methodist missions work in general?
So it was to the Wesleyan Methodist work in Sierra Leone. So yes, it was the Clarkes and others' work, but it was really the only Wesleyan Methodist mission work at the time. So it was, yes, it was the Clarks, their work, but it's all that they were doing as a church at that time.
Okay.
But the YMWB is actually instrumental in starting other works, as you'll see. So in late 1902, while the Clarks were home in the U.S. for a break, George was facing the possibility of not being able to reopen a Masumbo mission station due to a lack of funds. And this bothered him greatly because Alamami Kaloko, a local Muslim closet convert, he was not willing to acknowledge that he had converted for political reasons, but he requested that they come back there and man this mission station. So they felt like there was some real motivation to go back. While George was meditating on this one time, he felt like he had some divine inspiration. He decided to take a more formalized step to engage the children of the church to try to see if they could raise some more funds to be able to open this mission station. And looking back, Mary admits that she was kind of hesitant. She thought maybe they should wait, maybe they shouldn't do this. She wasn't sure the timing was right to start something like this, and she really didn't love the name, if she's honest. But later, looking back, she said it really embodied what it was about. So in December of that year, 1902, George wrote 2 letters. He wrote one to the children and one to the parents. And at that time, there was this periodical, the Wesleyan Methodist Magazine, and people would write letters to it and it would be printed. And so everyone kind of in the church would read it and they would see what was being communicated. So he wrote one letter to the children, one to the parents. The children, he asked to pay 1 cent a week for missions during the coming year. He asked them to send a note card with their name as a type of faith pledge, and he would promise to print their names in the magazine. And for the parents, he laid out a rationale that the children would become loyal supporters of the church and God's work if they started early in life. And they adopted the motto, "Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts," from Zechariah 4:6. So by 1903, the new group had a name, the Young Missionary Workers Band. Like I said, Mary wasn't a big fan, but it really captured the heart of children working together with God on behalf of missions. And then by November 1903, there were 1,300 names on the list for the YMWB, and it provided the funds to send 2 missionaries, Hattie Brooks and Emma Oates, to work in the Masumbo Mission Station School in Sierra Leone. So exactly what George had hoped for happened.
Yeah.
Around this time, the Wesleyan Methodist women assumed the leadership of the fledgling organization. And when Mary returned from Sierra Leone with Blackwater fever and was healed in 1906, she assumed the superintendency of the YMWB until they returned to Sierra Leone in 1908. So in that kind of 2-year period, she crisscrossed the country, mobilizing the Wesleyan children. In the early years, she and the women of the church coaxed the YMWB along. They began first by simply printing names of the lists of names of all the members, and then they slowly developed literature and a curriculum and a quarterly bulletin that contained missionary letters, stories, and programming for children to learn about other cultures and missions. In looking at looking at this literature, it's impressive and kind of overwhelming to see how much work they put into this and all the information and stuff that was kind of getting thrown out there to the children. It is also, if you look at it with the eyes of today, it can feel a little uncomfortable because sometimes the language is not always what we would want to use today. So even though they were often trying to push back against stereotypes of the time about color of the skin and what that kind of implied, they didn't always do it with language that we would find appropriate today. But one of the things that they often tried to do was present the inherent value and worth of African children, stating that they had similar abilities and winsome personalities as white children. So, as I said, they were kind of doing the best that they could at the time.
Right.
But looking back, we would hope that we would do better now.
Yeah.
So by 1910, the YMWB had raised funds to support the work of the first 3 missionaries to India. In 1916, they had surpassed 10,000 members and raised $10,000.
These 10,000 members, though, is that like 10,000 children that were giving this?
So probably not all children. Okay. Adults got very involved in this process. They were enthused and participated in leading the children. And there's actual evidence that they were giving under the children's fund as well. Okay. But But plenty of children were involved. Plenty of actual children were involved, but the adults were behind it too. But it's interesting how focusing on the children also mobilized the adults.
Yeah.
Whereas I don't know if the opposite is always true. If you focus on the adults, if the children get brought into the mix in the same way.
Sure, yeah. But it's just cool having that like specific invitation to the children to be involved.
Yeah. And some of the children were what we would consider older young people. So in 1914, there was nothing for the youth. And so they formed a senior young missionary workers band. So the SYMWB. And that was formed at Home College. In 1920, they reached a peak of 21,481 members and raised over $41,000 for the Wesleyan Methodist missions. In the 1920s, they maintained a steady membership between 15,000 and close to 17,000. I mean, we're talking some big numbers here for not a huge denomination.
Yeah.
And then branches appeared in India and Africa in 1919 and 1925 with children from these parts of the world giving and learning about missions as well. So it wasn't just North American children that were doing this. There were kids in other parts of the world as well. At the time of George's sudden death in 1929, the YMWB had raised $417,000 to support Wesleyan Methodist missions.
That's incredible. And that's like 30 years, not quite?
Yeah, just under 30 years. Mm-hmm. So as I said, George's death was quite sudden, and Mary remained a widow until her death in 1970. So that's, 41 years that she was a widow.
Wow, yeah.
And she continued serving the YMWB until 1942. And just in case you're not familiar with the Wesleyan Methodists and their history, they were not actually unique in their focus on mobilizing children in mission. Maybe the way it kind of arose was a little bit unique, but other holiness groups like the Nazarenes and Free Methodists were doing the same kinds of things, as were other evangelical groups and later Pentecostals also. So it's not that they were unique in this. It's just fun to kind of look at the numbers and see what they were able to do with mobilizing the children.
Yeah, I love that. There was a church in my area that they raised money last year for Velvet Ashes book club. And so, yeah, I love the history of bringing children into what God is doing around the world. And yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah. So what did Mary do in the rest of her life, kind of? We've talked about her work with the children, her work in Sierra Leone. Her missionary zeal never wavered. Even after her official duties ended, she returned to Sierra Leone to engage in missionary work as a self-funded missionary at the age of 74.
That's amazing.
She used $1,000 in savings, really all the money she had, to fund the trip. And when she was there, she's taught in the Bible schools and Bible institutes that had since developed. And she taught missionaries the Limba language, which she was so proficient at. And she easily re-engaged in speaking the Limba language while she was there. Many urged her to continue her translation work, and she stayed for 18 months. And she did pick up some of those translation works again. So then you think that she's done, right? At the age of 79, she returned again. This time she served as a housekeeper for a medical missionary and ministered among Africans and Syrians. And she stayed for another 18 months. Now, during this last and final trip, she was involved in an automobile accident in which she suffered a head wound. As it was happening, she recalled a portion of Psalm 42, quote, "Yet the Lord will command his loving kindness in the daytime and in the night." This was a verse that she had relied on in other crises that she had faced over the years. And she saw the Lord's hand providing for she and the other people that were in the car and keeping them from further harm. The doctor who treated her said, "Madam, there certainly is an unseen presence at work on your behalf." And she looked at him, obviously agreeing.
Yeah.
When I look back at her life, you can see that she was a lover of the word and a lifelong learner. In 1954, at the age of 82, she decided to do a self-study of New Testament Greek because a person she was living with was doing the same. Actually, they weren't doing self-study. They were studying at Houghton College. So she decided to self-study and take the same exam that her housemate took. and she passed the exam for her housemaid's class. Another thing that she was known for was praying without ceasing, and she was noted for praying for all the Wesleyan missionaries by name and having prayers that were full of praise. At the age of 86, still going strong, she continued revising the gospel translations of Luke, John, and Mark, and started translating the book of Matthew into the Limba language.
Wow.
So as I said before, her total years on the field were really only about 12. It doesn't seem like it takes up that much of her long life. However, as you've heard, her legacy is undeniably rich. She was a teacher, a linguist, a Bible translator, author, and missionary to the very end. She was described by some as a missionary of the missionaries. She taught and trained countless young people at Houghton College in Sierra Leone and through her work with the YMWB. Her Bible translation work and publications in Limba that she continued long after she left the field have a lasting impact on that community. The lasting legacy of committing the language to written form, publishing books in the language, making the Gospels available in the heart language of the people are enduring. The funds that were raised through the YMWB for missions and the children discipled through its programming are undeniable. In 1959, Houghton College, now university, awarded her a Doctor of Letters degree in recognition of her service and legacy. She was known as a lover of the word, prayer warrior, and believer in miracles. But perhaps the greatest legacy that I see from Mary Lane Clarke was that she had a love for the people of Sierra Leone. When Mary returned to Sierra Leone in her 70s, she was welcomed with open arms by the descendants of the friends she had previously worked with. In the history of the Wesleyan Methodist Mission in Sierra Leone, George and Mary wrote together. They recounted how in the early days of the mission, after the missionaries had faced much hardship and all the death and sorrow, local Christians wondered if the missionaries would return or come back. They told each other, "Wait, they'll return. They'll not leave us. Truly, they love us very much." And Mary Lane Clarke was one of those who returned again and again and again because she loved them. Even when she was not present in the body, her heart, soul, and mind were constantly working on their behalf.
Wow, there's so much in her life, Laura, that I am thinking about. It just seems like she really exemplified a life that was focused on Christ and the gospel and the Great Commission, even if that looked different in different seasons. Like you said, maybe we would look at the number of years that she was actually on the field. And I mean, maybe today that would sound like a lot. But in relation to how long she lived, it was not a big chunk of her life. But even if she was not, physically on the field that whole time, I just love how you have brought out that these things that were so much on her heart, her love for the people of Sierra Leone, her love for the Lord, like it just consumed everything that she did. Denise has said this different times, I think, as we have done multiple conversations, that sometimes our lives are like kind of a funnel and all of these different experiences come together into what God has for us. And so it can feel discouraging, if we come back from the field and it's like, okay, what now? If we've returned, it can feel like that part of our life is over. But I think Mary really exemplifies what it's like to have this purpose to love the Lord and to be devoted to the gospel and to God's kingdom, and just see what the Lord has for us in each season, that it might not be physically being on the field, and maybe it means going when you're in your 70s or whatever, which is crazy. But I love that she can be that model for us of just following the Lord and obeying him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just love how, even though it looked different later in life, she still had the same purpose was before her, and she got creative about how she did it. Maybe she wasn't going over as, the sanctioned missionary through the church, but okay, I'm going to find a way to get there and do it. Or I'm going to work with the children for 28 years and make sure
Right.
they know about Sierra Leone and the other mission work that we're doing. Yeah, I really love the creativity that she and George had and just how they shared about their work and their dedication to like educating and empowering and equipping and mobilizing others in their work as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, even it just impresses me that when she went at the age of 79, she served as a housekeeper for a medical missionary. Like that's really beautiful that she could have, said, well, I have all of this experience. And I don't know, I feel like if I was 79, I would be like, I'm ready to stay home.
Yeah.
So for her to just serve and be faithful in that way is that's really precious.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Laura, before I start wrapping up, is there anything else that we need to say?
We're going to be bringing some more stories to our listening audience in the coming months, and we're going to be hearing from some new voices too. I'm excited to share with this community some of the other stories that are out there that maybe no one's heard of. There's several of the friends that we're going to be inviting to work with us in the coming months are not necessarily based in North America or even Europe. So I think we're going to have some new and fresh stories for everyone that I'm excited to be able to bring and to share.
Yes, yeah, good things coming. And Laura, thank you so much for the work that you've done this month in bringing us the powerful story of Mary Lane Clarke and really helping make sure that the stories of these women who have sacrificed for the gospel are not forgotten. And that's so important. And we're so grateful for that. We'd also like to thank our sponsor as we wrap up today, Barnabas International, for their ongoing support of the Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast. Be sure to explore the valuable resources that they offer to encourage and support those who are serving cross-culturally at barnabas.org. If Mary's story has moved you, if you really enjoyed the story today, we'd love for you to share this episode with someone who could use a little bit of encouragement. Thank you so much for joining us on the Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast. We'll see you next time.